they pronounce this judgment, this condemnation, this evaluation of him, saying, this man is not from God because he doesn't keep the Sabbath like we do. Does that sound familiar to anybody? The comments that I get, the same arguments, the same sort of accusations from World Mission Society Church of God members after, what has it been now? Around 5 years or so I've been doing this, and the comments are nearly always the same thing. So I have a particular World Mission Society Church of God member who I'm having an interaction with. I'm going to read through some of this conversation, and then, as I said, I'm going to do a bit of venting, and I'm going to try to explain why what these comments do, this type of behavior, this type of accusation that World Mission Society Church of God members constantly bring, demonstrates, I think, so clearly that, this accusation that they'll say, you are doing what the Pharisees do. If we want to talk about who's being the Pharisees in this situation, these sort of comments demonstrate so clearly that the World Mission Society Church of God is, as Jesus puts it, like whitewashed tomb that inside are dead men's bones. And I don't like using these sort of religious Christian type of like strong, denunciations of other groups. But I think if you look at the context, if you look at the situations in the New Testament, the encounters between Jesus and the New Testament, the things the Pharisees would say and accuse Jesus and his disciples of, and then you examine that next to the World Mission Society Church of God members' behaviors, the individual members, but the organization as a whole, and just the entire structure of what they teach. One of the foundations of it is just this overarching condemnation based on outward things. So they condemn people based on their outward adherence to, whether they are keeping the rules as well as they think that they are. So the WMSCOG condemns those who they think are not keeping the rules as good as they are. And then they elevate themselves in their own minds as, oh, we are doing it. We got it right. We're better than those who aren't keeping Sabbath like we do, etc. So this, I'm going to say, I think is one of the most clear demonstrations of Pharisee-like behavior that I can possibly think of. And as I'm reading through some of the things that Jesus said to the Pharisees, just ask, in this situation between the World Mission Society Church of God, this group that considers itself to be this elite, the ones who are keeping all the rules right, they got it better than everybody else. Nobody else is doing it like they do. Everybody else is condemned, nasty, lost sinners, but they're right. God loves them because they're better. They're keeping the rules better. When you see that situation going on between them and whether it's myself who are speaking out, making these videos, or the former members who are sharing their thoughts, and the WMSCOG condemns them, or they condemn basically, every other pastor, Christian church organization besides themselves, ask yourself which of these parties fits in this category of Pharisee better? Which one looks more like the behaviors and the attitudes of the Pharisees? So let me go ahead and look at the actual comment. This person who's commenting goes under the name Hezekiah on YouTube. And so this is a comment on my recent video called Passover for Salvation. If you've watched anything I've talked about with Passover before, what I want to make clear is that when I talk about Passover, my main point is not to say that you shouldn't keep Passover. My main point is not to say that Passover was abolished. My main point is not to say that the apostles and disciples necessarily didn't keep it. Maybe they did. And if you want to keep Passover and Sabbath, do it. My point isn't to say not to do it or those things are bad. My point is to say that even if the apostles and disciples may have kept them, those who were Jews could have likely continued in those traditions. even if they did, what they did not do is look down on other people, condemn other people, judge other people's spirituality based on whether other people were keeping Sabbath and Passover. In other words, you never see the apostles and disciples making obedience to these rules, adherence to Sabbath and Passover. You never saw them making that this core thing that really became the core element of whether you were in a right standing with God or not. Like, they never made Passover and Sabbath the doorway into receiving forgiveness for God, which is exactly what the World Mission Society Church of God does, and really was exactly what the Pharisees did. They elevated these lesser things, these other things, and they placed on things an amount of importance that God did not place on them. So keeping Sabbath and Passover is not a bad thing. It can be a productive thing. It can be a good thing, a beneficial thing spiritually. But the apostles and disciples, even if they did keep them, which very likely some of them did, they did not make it a matter of salvation. They did not say to any Christian, keep this too, or else. They didn't say this is the way to be saved. And they didn't condemn others for not keeping it. So with that in mind, here's Hezekiah. He jumped in the comments and said, "You are acting differently from what the disciples and early church members did 2,000 years ago, except claiming yourself to be Christian. All the disciples did not only keep the Passover, they also gathered together for the day of Pentecost and also observed the Feast of Unleavened Bread, but also proclaim it all peoples until its abolishment in AD 325 after Jesus' death of 300 years." So to me, this is just another way of saying, hey, this accusation of you're not, he's saying you're not doing what the disciples did 2,000 years ago. And very often it comes as, hey, you're doing what the Pharisees did 2,000 years ago. So my response was this. I said, the disciples and Jesus didn't go around condemning and judging people and whether they were right with God based on if they were keeping Sabbath or Passover. In fact, that's exactly what the Pharisees did. They went around condemning and judging people, even Jesus, who weren't keeping Sabbath or the laws in the way that they did. That is exactly what you are doing right now. So then I quoted John 9:16, where it says, "Some of the Pharisees said, 'This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath.'" Just listen to that for a minute. What the Pharisees did when they saw Jesus, they were watching his life, watching his behaviors, his actions. They looked at him and they pronounced this judgment, this condemnation, this evaluation of him, saying, "This man is not from God, because he doesn't keep the Sabbath like we do." Does that sound familiar to anybody? Anybody that is familiar with this whole conversation, whether it's between myself and the WMSCOG or the WMSCOG's conversation with the rest of the world, who is who in this scenario? Let me just ask you that. Who is looking around, pointing the finger, and making judgments about people's spirituality and whether they are of God or not, dependent on their Sabbath observance? Well, it's not me. I'm not doing that. The former members who speak out on this channel, who get, lashed out at by WMS members, they're not the ones, pronouncing judgment, pointing fingers based on whether people are keeping the Sabbath or not. Who is? Well, people like Hezekiah. This is exactly what Hezekiah is doing. He's coming into this conversation with an assumption that he and the WMSCOG are keeping the rules of God the way everybody should. They're doing it right. They got it right. Everybody else has got it wrong. Then they're coming into the comments. They're seeing somebody who is critiquing them. They're also coming in with all these loaded assumptions about how Christians have changed Sabbath to Sunday, which is just not... maybe some think of it that way, but so many don't, or that Christians think that on Sunday we're observing the Sabbath, which again is just such a caricature, such ignorance that the WMS propagates to these members. So that he's coming in with all these assumptions, assuming, that I even think that the disciples didn't keep the things. Maybe they did. My view isn't contingent on, and the things I'm saying aren't contingent on whether or not the disciples continue keeping Passover and feasts. Maybe they did. But the point is, WMSCOG members like Hezekiah come in here with these assumptions that, oh, look at this guy on YouTube speaking against the church. Well, I know things about him. I know that he doesn't keep the Sabbath as well as I do. He doesn't keep it like I do. This man is not of God. He's not saying it in those exact words, but that's what he's saying, isn't it? Isn't that exactly what these World Mission Society Church of God members are constantly doing when they come into the comments and they make this evaluation of myself or other members and say, you're not keeping the rules of God as well as I am. It's really just this spiritual superiority complex that they are just gripped with, based in this self-focused, obedience-centered religion that says that, it's your efforts and your exertion and you crossing your I's and dotting your T's. I got that backwards. I'm trying to say. It's you be a good little boy and good little girl. You do all the right things and do it better than all those nasty sinners out there. And then God will like you more. You're better than other people because you're obeying better. That is very unfortunately the attitude of these members that come in the comments. And it reeks of pharisaical type behavior. It is the exact sort of posture of heart and mind that the Pharisees consistently operated, not only with all the other people around them, but with Jesus. They would make spiritual evaluations of people based on whether or not their outward observance of rules and regulations lined up with their preconceived ideas of what they should. And then they would say, this man is not of God because he's outwardly, I don't see him behaving and keeping the rules in the way I do. And I obviously got it all figured out. I got it right. I'm better than them. And so if they're not doing it like I am, they must not be of God. It's just this deeply baffling ignorance and arrogance, really, this religious arrogance that is just leading me to this video of just, I have to kind of vent about it a little bit. Again, trying to do this in love. I love you, Hezekiah. I care about you. I don't want to attack you or make you look stupid, but I want to call out ignorance and hypocrisy when you are publicly posting it on a YouTube video. And I said, that's what you're doing, Hezekiah. Pretty much was my response. So he said, you're trying to turn away from what I'm trying to say by bringing up your own assumption and lead to another discussion. Oh, Hezekiah, no, that's not what I'm doing. I'm simply pointing out what I think is an obvious observation, that the arguments you're presenting, the accusations you're bringing, not just you. When I say you right now, when I'm speaking to Hezekiah, I'm saying these things to the hundreds of members who have commented in this exact same format, bringing these exact same patterns of thinking, of making judgments and evaluations about myself and others based on our Sabbath keeping, which, again, as I said, John 9:16 is exactly what the Pharisees did. So he goes on to say, and you quoting this verse very wrongly, the reason Pharisee condemned Jesus for not keeping Sabbath is not because Jesus did not keep the Sabbath, but that he did not keep according to the way of Old Covenant, rest from work. Jesus' apostles and early Christians all kept service and listened to the sermons on the Sabbath. History of church until AD 500. Again, you are leading people astray with your own and wrong interpretation of the Bible verse. This is not being responsible. Would you explain the reason why Jesus condemned the Pharisees then when he was saying that they are hypocrites and brood of vipers? Okay, so he says the Pharisees condemned Jesus not for not keeping the Sabbath entirely, but because Jesus didn't keep the Sabbath according to the way of the Old Covenant. And I think you're right. The Pharisees weren't saying that Jesus didn't keep the Sabbath, but more that I think he wasn't keeping it in the way that they thought he should. I think they had built on top of the law of God all their own ideas and rules and regulations and stipulations about what it had to look like to keep the Sabbath. And Jesus wasn't following those things. Okay, so this is not a matter of Jesus not keeping Sabbath according to the Old Covenant. He did. He fulfilled the law perfectly, or else I think we're running into a whole other issue. But if we want to talk about who is keeping Sabbath correctly, let's just talk about that for a minute, okay? Because you're coming, Hezekiah and other WMSCOG members, assuming you're still, I'm sure, at this point in the video, if you're still here thinking, well, this guy doesn't keep the Sabbath at all, so this is an entirely different situation. Well, let's talk about that, okay? I'm the one who doesn't keep the Sabbath in the way you think I should. Well, first I'd say, where in the New Testament were Jews or Gentiles ever told to pick up the law of Moses, these customs, these ordinances, these rules that were handed to a specific nation, Israel? This was part of God's covenant between a specific nation. And never in the New Testament did the apostles mention, at points that would have been very great opportunities for them to mention it in the midst of different epistles where these discussions were happening, never do they say, hey, oh, by the way, Gentile believers, one thing you need to make sure of is that you're keeping the Sabbath the way the Jews do, because that's a very, very important thing and one of the proofs that you're truly following God. Oh, and by the way, also, if you don't keep Passover, you can't be forgiven of your sins. Don't you think that would have been a good thing for the apostles to mention at some point? Don't you think one of the moments in the book of Acts, the only book where you see the apostles preaching the gospel, don't you think it would have been convenient and like a good idea to bring up Passover, which you say is the core of the gospel? But they never do, okay? And they never mention it in the book of Acts. They never command it. You can point to a few examples where it is sort of vague that maybe they kept the Passover. There's a mention that they did certain activities on the Passover, but that's irrelevant. The point is, maybe they kept Passover, but they did not command Passover as a requirement for salvation. I have yet for you to give me proof that they did, other than you taking Jesus's words in Matthew, the Passover supper with him and the disciples. You take his words that were clearly symbolic, the wine and the bread representing blood and body, it was a representation of something he was about to literally, physically do on the cross. It was on the cross he gave his body and blood. It was a symbolic representation that took place at the Passover supper between him and the disciples. That's the only place that is even slightly looks to be in your favor that Passover was intended for salvation. But I think it can be easily shown that that's not what was going on there. The rest of the New Testament says over and over and over again, whenever it's mentioned, what must be due to be saved? What must be done for forgiveness of sins? Is Passover mentioned one time? No, it is not. That is a huge, huge problem for you guys, that you have not even begun to provide even a close, even adequate or meaningful answer for. You continue to ignore that, I would say, largely. There's no excuse in your position for why every time the disciples preached the gospel, the recorded sermons of the apostles preaching the gospel, you see people becoming saved through what they preached. No mention of Passover, no observance of Passover. You see people being told your sins are forgiven, no Passover included or involved there. You see people receiving the Holy Spirit, which is God's seal, it says, showing that he approves of the person without keeping Passover. You see people speaking in tongues. You see people, directly asking Jesus, hey, what must we do to be doing the works of God? Jesus doesn't mention Passover. He says, this is the work of God. John 6, believe in the one whom he has sent. This is a problem that I have emphasized, I've repeated multiple times in the past, and your side, the WMS, has not even begun to offer any kind of meaningful explanation for. And so I'm just going to put that out there again and say that must be considered in this. But the point is, you're emphasizing here in your comment that what this really comes down to is keeping the Sabbath the correct way, right? That's what they're getting on to Jesus about. So your assumption is that you guys are the ones keeping it the correct way, which is just not the case. I'll just say that's not the case, okay? And I can play clips from former members like Kelsey and others who will kind of detail what their days on the Sabbath look like. You mentioned rest from work as one of the key points of the Sabbath. And that aspect, like that is the Sabbath, right? The going clear back to Genesis, God rested on the seventh day and set it apart as holy. Sabbath, the purpose of the Sabbath, one of the things that it is about, that we're supposed to and should learn from Sabbath, is that it's a reminder to cease from our own labors, to cease from our own efforts and striving, and to remember that our provision, our well-being, comes from God as a gift, does not come from us. Our well-being in life doesn't come down. And ultimately, we need to remember on the Sabbath, the purpose of it is to sit down and rest, relax, and to know that, and trust, really it comes down to faith. It's about believing that God is a good Father who provides all of our needs, apart from us, doing work and striving and efforting and stressing and running anxiously around trying to do all we need to do to make sure we're good and we're obeying all the rules and we're going to be okay when Father and Mother return. Okay, so true Sabbath is about rest. It's about calling to mind again that our well-being, if I could say it in simple terms, our well-being is a reminder that our well-being is in God's hands. It's not in our abilities. And that is what Sabbath is meant to remind us. It is meant to be a day of rest. But that's not what you guys do, Hezekiah. You as a WMSCOG member, tell me honestly, is your Sabbath about rest? Do you find rest and refreshment for your soul on Sabbath? Because the testimony I've heard from members is that it is a very stressful, time-consuming day. Tell me in the Bible where it says that on the Sabbath you have to be in church all day. Tell me where in the Bible does it say on the Sabbath you have to wear a suit and wear your best clothes and look good? Where in the Sabbath does it says that you have to give multiple tithes on that day? Show me that in the Bible, okay? Because you're the one coming here, thinking, you and other members coming here thinking you're the elite ones. You're the ones who got Sabbath figured out, and you're keeping it. You got this thing down. Well, I'm looking at the way you're doing it, and I don't see the Bible saying to do it that way, Hezekiah. So I'm just asking, could you show me where in the Bible does it say to do the things that you do on the Sabbath? Because it's not there. So you're coming here accusing other people and really looking around accusing the world, saying because nobody keeps Sabbath and Passover like we do, they're obviously not of God, which again, that should send red flags off in your mind and say, wait a minute, that sounds familiar. Oh yeah, John 9:16, when some of the Pharisees said, looking at Jesus, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. This all comes down to, what is said in 1 Samuel. I can't remember the exact verse, but it's where I think it's maybe David or maybe Samuel who says it, that man looks at the outward appearance. Man looks at what is outward, but God looks at the heart. That was exactly the situation going on between Jesus and the Pharisees, and that is exactly the situation going on between the World Mission Society Church of God and myself and other people in their condemnation. They look at the outward activity of people. Outwardly, are people behaving and performing these different rules and regulations the way I think they should? If they are, well, obviously nobody is, unless you're part of the WMSCOG in their minds. But they're not keeping these things the way I think they should. They're not from God. That's a Pharisee for you. That is what the Pharisees do, Hezekiah. That is what you are doing. Regardless of whether they're condemning Jesus for keeping it correctly or not, that's kind of beside the point. The point is that they were focused on this outward thing and completely missing the truth of who Jesus actually was. And so rather, than looking at Jesus's fruit, his behavior, the character that he was coming in, his true fear of the Lord, his spirit of wisdom, his love for God, although all that was right there, evident right in front of them, all they could think about was, this guy isn't keeping these outward rules the way I think he should. And in doing so, they completely, entirely missed the point. That again, man looks at the outward, God looks at the heart. Paul, Jesus, they both will say things throughout the New Testament explicitly saying, Paul Williams saying Galatians, the only thing that counts, it's not being circumcised or uncircumcised. It's not keeping Sabbath or not keeping Sabbath. It's not Passover or not. He says the only thing that matters is faith working through love. Isn't that what Jesus did? Jesus operated by faith, and he constantly walked in love toward others. The Pharisees they didn't recognize that. That wasn't in their minds because they were focused on the outward. They had no concern for what was inward. That is what you guys are doing. Hezekiah and WMSCOG members. You guys are obsessed with outward things. That's just the case. That is the evidence. I could go back through years of comments and accusations from you guys and make, I think, a pretty foolproof case that you guys come in a focus on outward things and completely neglect inward transformation. You're not focused on your own hearts, what is really going on inside of your own hearts. Are you coming, into these comments with the attitude of Jesus, with the sort of spirit that Jesus walked in, the wisdom he walked in, the love he walked in? Or are you coming in an arrogant, a religious elitist sort of, I'm better than other people because I keep the rules and they don't sort of attitude like the Pharisees did? Well, I guess I'll let everybody else be the judge. I'll let other people read the comment of Hezekiah. I'll let other people evaluate the other, hundreds or thousands of comments that are on all the other videos relating to all this and decide which attitude, which spirit are these WMSCOG members walking in.